In everyday life, we often think of repetition as something dull. Routine can feel mechanical. But in art, repetition can feel strangely comforting. The same form returning again and again, not to impress but to slow us down. It becomes the visual equivalent of a steady breath in a world that feels increasingly out of rhythm. In this video, we explore why repetition in art does not feel empty and why it can quietly hold our attention. In everyday life, repetition is often something we try to escape. Repeated tasks become routine, and routine becomes something we stop noticing. We can see this clearly in the industrial assembly line. A human being becomes just another part of the machine, repeating the same motion thousands of times a day until the person seems to disappear and only the task remains. This kind of repetition is about efficiency. It is about results. Time feels flattened. Attention slowly fades. This is why repetition is often associated with boredom or with the feeling that nothing is really happening. But art does something radical. Repetition in art works in a very different way. In art, repetition is not accidental, it is a choice. The artist decides to return to the same form, the same subject, or the same structure again and again. Because change is limited, our attention shifts. Instead of scanning for what is new, we begin to notice what is quiet. Small differences start to appear. A slight change in spacing, a softer edge, a slower rhythm. It slows perception. It gives the eye time to settle and the mind permission to rest. Nothing is demanding immediate reaction. Nothing is asking to be solved. With each return, the work becomes more familiar and at the same time more subtle. Repetition stops feeling mechanical and begins to feel attentive. This is where repetition becomes calming. Not by adding more, but by allowing less to happen. In that stillness, repetition begins to follow a rhythm that mirrors our own biology. Our most basic way of calming ourselves is through the breath, in and out, over and over. When art mirrors this rhythm, it begins to act like a visual metronome. It gently syncs our internal tempo to the work. In this space, repetition becomes a form of presence. You cannot rush through a repetitive painting to find an ending because there is none. The ending is the same as the beginning. You are simply there. And in a world that constantly demands we move faster, being invited to stay still begins to feel unexpectedly precious. This way of seeing is not abstract. Many artists have returned to the same forms again and again. For them, repetition was not a lack of ideas. It was a commitment to looking again. One of the clearest examples is Giorgio Morandi. For most of his life, Morandi painted the same simple objects: bottles, jars, small containers arranged on a table. He spent decades working in a small room in Italy, painting the same collection of bottles and boxes. He did not need a grand landscape or a new subject every week. He understood that by looking at the same few objects every day, he could begin to see what others missed. At first glance, the paintings appear almost identical. The forms barely change, the colours remain muted, nothing dramatic seems to happen. But the longer you look, the more you begin to notice how carefully each painting differs from the last. A bottle shifts slightly forward, The distance between objects tightens or loosens. Light becomes softer or more restrained. Repetition for Morandi was not limitation, it was a way of paying attention. Each return allowed him to look again with a little more patience and a little less urgency. Another form of repetition emerges in the work of Agnes Martin. Martin lived much of her life in the solitude of the New Mexico desert. She was not interested in the noise of the world. She was interested in the innocence of the mind. She once said that her paintings were about happiness, not the loud or excitable kind, but the quiet, steady happiness of a calm sea or a clear sky. Martin worked with grids, lines, and subtle variations. That sameness is intentional. If you look closely at her lines, they are not perfect. Because they were drawn by a human hand, they carry tiny shifts, slight variations in pressure, and moments where the graphite fades. This is where the comfort begins. In a machine-made world, a grid can feel cold. But in Martin's hands, repetition feels warm. It becomes a record of a human being finding steadiness within vastness. The repetition is not there to produce a result, it is there to sustain a state of being. It slows the viewer down, allowing small differences to matter. For Martin, repetition was not about control, it was about quiet attention. In both cases, repetition is not about sameness. It is about staying with something long enough for difference to reveal itself. These artists didn't repeat because they had nothing new to say. They repeated because they understood that attention deepens with return. Repetition in art is not about making the same thing twice. It is a way of learning how to look and feel. Outside of art, we are drawn to repetition more than we realize. We listen to the same music again and again. We walk familiar paths. We return to books we already know the ending of. Not because they surprise us, but because they remove uncertainty. When something is familiar, our attention softens. We are no longer trying to predict what comes next. We are free to notice how we feel. In art, this creates a quiet shift. What changes is not the work, but the viewer. With each return, we bring a slightly different mood, a different level of patience, a different kind of attention. This is why repetition feels comforting. It gives feeling time to arrive.